Hello. Welcome to Critical Rep, a podcast where we explore representation in popular film media using a critical lens. We are two sociologists that want to expand our knowledge of representation in media and want to take you along for the ride. I'm Kat.
I'm Jenna.
And we have a guest today. Her name is Imogene. So before we introduce her, we will be we're going to be bringing critical analysis of one TV show or movie per week that tackles some serious topics, including race, sex and gender, class and justice, and much more. So join us for a fun and interesting discussion of some popular shows where we delve deep into how and what they represent for those watching. So also just please note that this is our perspective on representation and not on the brilliant people who work hard to bring these film media. But representation matters in this and all forms of media. Since so many people are exposed to these popular shows and movies, it can make someone feel seen or depict issues that mirror reality or even popularize problematic tropes. So join us as we explore the possibilities and constraints of popular film media. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the US version of Shameless. So, how are you?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, I'll quickly introduce myself. So my name is Imogene. My pronouns are she, her. I went to Mount Royal University like Jenna and Kat. So we met in our undergrad degree in sociology. So my background is in sociology. I'm currently completing my master's in social work at the University of Calgary. So still doing theory, still thinking critically, slightly different focus. Sometimes I miss the sociology, but sometimes I'm like, nah, I like the social work. Yeah, so happy to be here and to join and to talk about one of my favorite TV shows probably on Netflix currently.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Imogene. That's great. And yeah, we are all friends from our undergraduate institution. I guess we met there. So yeah, how are you doing today, Jenna?
I am good.
You recently changed your hair.
Did.
Love it.
Oh, fall.
Yeah. Yes.
You can't tell, but I'm also wearing a ghost shirt.
Amazing.
I'm just really embracing Halloween early this year.
Well, shall we get into it?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Cool. So we're talking about Shameless today, and I'll go through sort of the synopsis. I actually found two. So the first one's on Showtime, and it is a Chicagoan. Frank Gallagher is the proud single dad of 6 smart, industrious, independent kids who without him would be perhaps better off. When Frank's not at the bar spending what little money they have, he's passed out on the floor, but the kids have found ways to grow up in spite of him. They may not be like any family you know, but they make no apologies for being exactly who they are. And then the second one is from Wikipedia, which is the series depicts the poor, dysfunctional family of Frank Gallagher, a single father who does not raise his 6 children. He spends his days drunk or in search of misadventures, and his children learn to take care of themselves. The show's producers sought to distinguish this production from previous American working-class shows by highlighting how Frank's alcoholism and drug addiction affects his family. The show's creator, Paul Abbott, said, quote, "It's not My Name is Earl or Roseanne. It's got a much graver level of poverty attached to it. It's not blue collar. It's no collar," end quote. Showrunner John Wells fought efforts to place the show in the South or in a trailer park. Quote, "We have a comedic tradition of making fun of the people who, in those worlds," end quote. He said, "The reality is that these people aren't the other," in quotations. "They're people who live 4 blocks down from you and 2 blocks over," end quote. So I wanted to include that last part of the synopsis I found on Wikipedia because I find it very interesting, because we're talking about representation and we talk about things like problematic tropes where if this show was set in the South or in a trailer park, it would be buying into something that is, a trope that we're all familiar with and highly problematic in many ways. So I don't know who wants to speak to that first, but I thought that would be a good place to start this conversation.
For sure. I'm just going to quickly, for people who haven't seen the show, the 6 kids, I just want to say that the age range is very wide. So like Fiona, she's the oldest. I believe when the season 1 begins, she's like 19 or 20 is my
21.
No, 21.
Yeah,
Thank
she was
you.
21.
And then we have Philip, who's called Lip in the show. He would be the second child. Then we have Ian. Then we have Debbie. Then we have Carl. And then last but not least, we have Liam. So just so people know, and Liam, when the show starts, he's still an infant. So we go from 21 to infancy and fill in the rest here. So just so people have that context, I think that's important. But yeah, let's talk about buying into trailer park tropes about poverty.
I mean, there's so many examples out there. Like, even if we look at the previous episode that we did on sex education, where Maeve is the student in poverty and she lives in a trailer park. That's just what we assume is if you're poor, that you live in a trailer park or you live in an apartment, in a rundown apartment or something like that. Whereas in Shameless, they live in a house in Southside Chicago. And I appreciate the fact that the show didn't play into that, like, oh, they're poor, so they live in a trailer park thing. Also, some trailer parks are really nice.
Also, like, we could make a comment here, I feel like, about like downsized living and like this American dream notion of where you have to have like a mega mansion, but that's like something for another day. But I agree with Jenna. I think that definitely struck me the first time I started watching it, where you are welcomed into this family's life and you can see the extreme poverty that they're living in, where they're literally the kids who are 10, 8, whatever, they have to contribute money to the household to keep the heat going, the electricity going, but they're living in a home. And I think that that is a really that is much more of the experience of people who are, like I would say, like they called it no class, we could call it working class, where people are living paycheck to paycheck or work job to work job. They are housed, they do have homes. And in that way, I think it's really interesting that we get to be invited into that space, because I think we also conflate poverty with those trailer parks or apartments where we can have like hyper surveillance over them. And so in this way, I think they are making a comment that not everybody who lives in these situations has such intense surveillance, because I would definitely say that they're living in Southside Chicago, and there is still that idea of surveillance occurring in that neighborhood. However, when you're living in a home, there's a little bit of privacy between you and the world, and like you and this dysfunction maybe that you're hiding in the home, which there is much of, not just in the Gallagher household, but in other households. In the neighborhood as well. But that's what I really did appreciate about this show, is that every person who we meet kind of in that South Side area who lives working class, kind of paycheck to paycheck, job to job, they all live in houses. And I think it helps to dismantle that comedic, and I think it's interesting they call it comedic, because I'm not sure, I have to think about that more, but I think it's really interesting that they conflate like people from poverty in the South or trailer park, trailer park trash comes to mind, like they conflate that with like humor. I think that's really interesting.
I don't think that it's wrong, though. I would definitely argue that like a lot of TV shows and films that are set in trailer parks or in the South that are focused on poor families are comedies. You know, like the synopsis mentioned My Name is Earl. That's a comedy. Roseanne is a comedy.
I think of Trailer Park Boys.
Trailer Park
That's
Boys.
a comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think that it's used as a comedic trope. And I really appreciate that this show gives more of like a real life glance into what it's like to live in poverty.
For sure. They definitely do. And I see what you mean now that you mentioned that. And I would say that there's still humor embedded in the show, but it's not the focal point. It's a drama. Like, it's a drama show. Like, that's the point of it. You reminded me of something else when you mentioned that. But so if we're talking about how people who live in trailer parks are always supposed to be kind of like funny, that to me would equate to us having an understanding of them as unintelligent.
I was just going to say that.
Like stupid or dopey or whatever. And what I also appreciate about Shameless is that all the kids are very clever. And Lip, of course, he's hyper intelligent. And I think that just goes to show that it money doesn't actually equate to intelligence. Intelligence comes from multiple different avenues. And I think there is something to be said about the the clever industriousness of living in poverty, where because you're constantly having to figure many pieces out, I think that makes you like a really quick thinker and like good on your feet and stuff. And like you have to, I appreciate that they smash this idea of what intelligence is and where it belongs.
For sure. And speaking more to the intelligence thing, I appreciate that they kind of show different types of intelligence. Like, it's not like Fiona didn't graduate high school because her mom took off and when she was, I think, 16 or 17 and had to step in as the caregiver for the other 5 children. And because Frank is useless. And you know, so they don't automatically write Fiona as this unintelligent character. She actually is presented as someone that had a lot of really good promise before her circumstances took over. Like, I was just rewatching season 1 and she was like a track star in high school. You know, they showed all of these things that, like, had her circumstances been different, she would have succeeded in the way that we expect to see success, instead of succeeding in the way that she has succeeded.
Exactly. And I think there's like twofold stuff going on there. You know, like there's a really interesting piece there too about how when you're growing up in those circumstances, or you're existing in living in poverty, like you can have the ability to be anything, and it's actually the circumstances, the structure you're living in that actually takes away your opportunity to continue to move forward. And you know, I think that's really important that we like talk about too, like where there's lots of people who, had they not been living in the circumstances they've been living in, like they you know, could have been the next insert famous name here, or, you know, even gone and done things that made them feel good. And unfortunately for Fiona, the collusion of completely like an absent mother and an alcoholic, drug addicted father had put all that burden on her to take care of the family.
Just to speak to that a little bit further, like we see that really strongly in Lip's arc later on when he goes to, I think, is it the University of Chicago? I believe government financial assistance and probably partial scholarship. And he's also in a work-study program, which then it shows that his timing with his work-study impacts his studies, which then reduces his scholarship amount and all of these things. And he forgot to, well, he didn't forget. There were external circumstances where he was unable to reapply for his government aid. And in the article that I found, that I can no longer locate, there is a point in there where it says that the professor's like, just go home, reapply for next semester, get your financial aid, and Lip looks at him dead in the eye and is like, I can't go back to that house. If I go back, I am in it and I am never getting out. So like the show does a really good job at showing all of the, help me with this sociological term that I'm completely blanking on. Social determinants of something.
Social determinants of health. Well, social determinants of health, but
yeah.
it also be like social, just your social location, right? Yeah. That's what we would say in social work, like your social location. Lip's social location is, if he goes home, he kind of gets sucked back into the chaos of the home, and once he gets sucked in, he can't pull himself out, because it's all encompassing.
Which, unfortunately, spoiler alert, happens. And he falls into alcoholism, and he drops out of school. He runs into issues with the law. You know, it all kind of unravels for him, unfortunately. There's just a lot of scenes throughout the show, I think, where they do a really good job of showing the characters' potential of getting out of the situation, but their internalized ideas of, this is just who I am, I'm stuck here. Like Carl is applying for West Point. He's doing really well in that regard. And then he gets a job offer at some fast food chain to like work his way up the ranks there. And he withdraws his application, or is going to withdraw his application to West Point to continue on this fast food career, because he thinks that's all he's cut out for. Because that's what society tells people in poverty that they're cut out for. You know, we're never shown a success story.
Mm-hmm. I would argue that actually, because it sounds like a lot of the show, which I actually haven't seen, which is why I'm not commenting much on today's episode, but it sounds like a lot of the show is sort of demonstrating the juxtaposition of how people are supposed to be striving for the American dream, like you mentioned earlier, Imogene, because we are shown examples of like, people do it all the time. You can just, rise out of poverty and like become Oprah, for example, which is just not the case for so many people. But part of sort of the embedded culture in America and Canada is that we're supposed to strive for that. And so we're supposed to be, individually driven to get yourself out of poverty. And so it's really interesting that you sort of shifted with that comment, because it was like, on the other hand, they're demonstrating in this show that like a lot of people see that as sort of the dream, but they understand that there might not be potential for that. And so they're taking a path just that they know is familiar or, doable for their life path.
Yeah.
So
I think I would say,
I think I would say that we're definitely presented constantly with the idea of individualism and that we have to do that success story for ourselves. But in the context of popular media, like fictional stories, we don't get shown that. You know what I mean? So even though we have examples of like Oprah or Steve Jobs or, like whoever else like failed their first 100 times and now they're like these billionaire people. I don't have a lot of examples of TV shows or films where the characters start off in poverty and then have this quote unquote success arc. Like if we talk about My Name is Earl or Roseanne or Trailer Park Boys, there's no success arc. They just get stuck in that.
this leads perfectly into what I was going to say. So they do actually play onto this juxtaposition a little bit with Fiona's character, where in the later seasons, she actually comes into some money and a little bit of power. And she kind of almost becomes like, I want to say like a petite bourgeoisie where she like owns stuff. But they show you the downfall of that, which is when you are coming from a place of poverty, you aren't savvy. And by savvy, I don't mean that's a feeling of Fiona. I mean that rich people learn how to propagate their richness. They learn the language, they learn the skills, they learn all that kind of stuff to figure out how to do it effectively. Mm-hmm. And Fiona fails horrendously, tragically, yes, in her pursuit of wealth and individualism and that American dream, because she lacks the knowledge to know how to do it, to know how to play the game, I'm going to say, because it's not that she can't do it. She just lacks the knowledge to do it. She probably could do it if she was educated, like all the wealthy people in the show are. Yeah. And they also juxtapose her versus another individual whose name is escaping me, but she's an older woman who also grew up on the South Side, who is actually is that classic American dream success story, who went from living in the South Side to now owns a lot of properties, makes a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And then she's constantly, her and Fiona have a lot of interactions in those later seasons. Is really interesting to see. Because also, if you think about generationally, it was probably a little bit easier. And remember, these are all white people. Like, I think we have to be cognizant of that. Like, both of these women are white. So this older white woman was able to succeed, maybe because of the way that the system was structured back then, where people could have a lot more class trajectory or class transition. Whereas Fiona is growing up in our age, millennial age, kind of this age where capitalism is really rampant and really like strongly embedded, and she fails horribly because the system is so stacked against people. So they do actually, whilst, talking about the pursuit of the American dream, pull up your bootstraps, they're also showing you how it's not a reality, how it can never be effective. But one of my critiques of the show is that only the white people in the show get to pursue this dream. None of the BIPOC people in the show ever get the opportunity really to pursue it. And maybe some people would comment, well, like V and Kevin kind of, but V, being a woman of color, a Black woman, she has to pursue it in relation to Kevin, who is a white man. Mm. So, like, I think that is definitely, like, when we're talking about that pursuit of the American dream and individualism and pulling ourselves out of poverty, they still are only showing the capacity for that if you're white. And maybe consciously, that's commentary. They were making commentary there. Maybe that's how they envision it. Oh, if you're white, you can, maybe there's more ability for you to pull yourself out of
it. I don't want to give an answer to that because I'm not in the writer's room. But based on the way that they approached race and politics in later seasons, I would hope that it is a commentary that they're making.
For the general viewing public, they're probably just going to consume it maybe uncritically, and maybe for those of us who do look at things more critically, we're going to pick up on more of those subtleties. Mm-hmm. They talk about ICE a lot, so that's definitely something that I think that they do weave into the show a lot, is just these politics in America that create a lot of conflict. And I would say the show's blessing, but it's also its curse, is that they deal with these things, I think, realistically, in the sense that they're messy and they're complicated, which means that sometimes the things that they're discussing, they get really wrong. They get really wrong. And I also think that that's the nature of a lot of these things that we're talking about, is that they are messy and complicated and hard to unravel because they all feed into one another. And so sometimes when that was happening, it was it was really good and poignant. But then other times when I'm watching it and they're doing it, I just have to sit there and just, you know, do that like cringe face where you like pull your blanket up over your nose and you're like, are you really, is this what we're going to go this way?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like if you don't have that critical eye to look at it with the level of knowledge that you need to watch those scenes and understand what they're trying to do, they're perpetuating really shitty ideas. But I don't think that that's the goal. Not that I'm excusing it at all. I think that they're trying to do it in like this is the majority of the way that Americans see this topic. So it's unrealistic for us to write our characters any other way. And I think that a great example of that is when Ian starts dating the trans guy and has no idea, you know, like it shows his education arc on trans issues. Because when they first get together and they're dancing at the club and then the guy says something about him being trans, Ian's like, oh, no, I'm gay. I don't like women. You know, and that's where he starts, and then he gets introduced to a bunch of different genders and sexualities at a lunch, and he's just like sitting there like, what the hell are you talking about? Because his brain knows gay and straight, and that's it. So I think that was something that they did really well, was showing that there is a overall lack of knowledge about this topic if you're not in it, but showing that you can educate yourself and like learn about it to get out of that ignorance.
Absolutely. And they do handle, I think, why can't I remember the character's name? I feel really bad because I feel like I should know, and I feel like I'm being disrespectful because I can't.
Yeah. Is
think.
it Trevor?
Trevor, maybe.
I feel like it's Trevor. And he also plays a trans man in The Fosters, which is going to be our 3-episode arc at the end of this. And let me tell you, there are some differences in the ways that the show approach his character, and it's really interesting.
Yeah,
anyway, Trevor.
I'm glad Trevor. So they do also do a good job, I think, of Trevor's story. So Trevor works for housing kind of nonprofit organization for trans and like LGBTQ2S plus youth, trying to get them housing, shelter, food, and they really do show you the like the lack of you know, funding and availability for these youth and what that does. You know, they don't, and they do it, and I think and I know that this part I can tell they were being really sensitive because they did it in such a way that it was very like neutral and didn't make any waves. They were like, we're just going to be as like factual as possible in the storytelling of this piece. But I agree with you, Jenna. Like, they definitely take the education, like Ian, and they show you how you can, through coming into contact and having dialogue, how much that can change perspective and help you understand and build empathy. I'm glad you brought this point up, though, because there's also a piece within this whole arc with Trevor that really bothered me. And it's when they're kind of like sort of getting back together. And they go to the club and they're picking up bears. So these are bigger, culturally, people might call them fat or overweight, gay men. They tend to be really hairy. It was very stereotyped and also really awful. Like, you're just using these bigger men to make you feel good because they're big and they're cuddly and they're they were just playing into
and they're
it
so
really.
Grateful to be with you. And
They're so grateful that you, a skinny, like white, like femme, or you know what I mean, like boy is going to be interested in them or whatever. And like, I just found that to be so heartbreaking because fat phobia is a thing and we don't need to perpetuate that. We don't. Yeah. And so that definitely for me was one point in the show where I was like, 2 thumbs way, way down. Get rid of this fat phobic rhetoric, please. And I mean, we can see in this show too that they don't actually pay any attention to difference of body shape. Like, that's something that's completely lacking from the show. Yeah. All the characters are traditional body shapes.
Yeah, they're very fit.
Fiona is very thin.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say Debbie's like curvy, like, you know what I mean? So they play into all of these body shapes that we are comforted by, that feel normal to us, and then they demonize the fat body in this very gross way. I was like, no.
Yeah. And it's especially interesting because, like, that's not the reality of poverty. If you're never able to go out and exercise, all you're doing is working, and the only thing you can afford to eat is like cheap fast food and stuff like that, you don't look like the people on this show. So I think that's like one area necessarily. I think that's one area where like they don't really approach it super realistically. You know, like a lot of these people have like full on abs. And I'm like, I've never once seen Fiona work out or V work out, you know? Anyways, what are some other general... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, let me just clarify, because when you were describing the sort of body types, you use the word normal and the word traditional, and I just wanted to clarify that I think what you meant was in media, it's traditional and normal. So I just wanted to clarify that, because like we're just talking about media in general, like the images we're used to seeing from media and from like all sorts of media. So
no, thank you for clarifying. Definitely. I don't believe that to be reality in the real world, but in media, I do think there's like a TM standard body, and you're right. Yeah,
exactly.
I meant in media, they're TM standard bodies, but in real life, they are just another body amongst many a body. Yes. And I think that's something that they could have done better too. Is just like, if you're living in poverty, you might not have the best diet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be overweight or anything like that. But they all seem to not really have any health conditions or like any sort of anything like that, and you know, not necessarily, that's not necessarily accurate depiction. I understand for the purposes of like continuity probably and ease of, but I think it's something to be critiqued. You know, you need to represent all people, and if you're only representing one body type, that is a problem.
And I think that is an interesting topic too that they might be leaving out, is healthcare, because especially in the USA, that's a big concern for many people in poverty, because you literally just can't afford healthcare. So often people who can't afford healthcare just allow themselves to have the ailments of whatever kind for far too long, and then you know, end up in situations where you have to be hospitalized, and that's like horrendously devastating because of how you have to pay for healthcare in the USA, which is something I often don't think about because I live in Canada and we have you know, universal healthcare here.
Just so interesting.
Yes.
Healthcare is covered so much in the show, actually. There's this whole thing where like Veronica is, what do they call her? A ghetto nurse, which we can talk about that. But so V works in a senior's home and somehow has access to like a bunch of different kinds of medications, which it's never really shown how she gets access to them, but I'm pretty confident that she just like takes them from where she works.
Or the implication is that she's stealing them, which is problematic because she's Black.
So she is the person that the Gallaghers go to if they are having any kind of a health issue, whether they're injured because they've gotten into a fight, or Debbie gets like this really intense rash on her arm at one point. And so V has all of these medical textbooks in her home, and they are her she is always their first stop. When Debbie gets the rash, Fiona says, "We need to have V look at this now." And Debbie's like, "Oh, it's not a big deal." And Fiona's like, "Yeah, but at least V can tell us if we need to go to the doctor." And then we can talk about Frank and the hospitals.
Can I just
Yes.
interject 1 second?
Yes, absolutely.
So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's a really important point that I missed, because often when folks can't afford to get things like healthcare or go to the doctor, it becomes a community thing. And I think that that's an important thing that we're talking about a lot in all of the rhetoric right now, because I mean, I just thought of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and the push to defund the police. And as many listeners may know, if you listen to our intro episode, both Jenna and I identify as abolitionists. And so this conversation is so relevant right now, and it totally applies in this situation, because you just described community care, because they have a person that they go to before going and spending money on actual doctors. So
Absolutely. And just sticking with V for a minute, because she's a really interesting character, and you definitely want to root for her. What I think is really unfortunate about her character is she's stuck in between being a mammy, like a representation of a mammy. So like the mammy is a Black woman, right, who's constantly caring for the white folk, which is exactly what she's doing if she's their nurse. And then she's stuck between that and the characteristic of being a Jezebel. So she's constantly clothed in a very promiscuous manner. She has really what maybe her and Kevin in their relationship, they have very and I say unconventional in quotation marks, because again, like, there's nothing wrong with what you like in the bedroom. I would say that for most people, though, there were probably some scenes with Kevin and V that were uncomfortable for them, because they did go there when they were talking about stuff in the bedroom. But again, though, it's that depiction of her as promiscuous and freaky and all of this kind of stuff. And I just think it really sucked. That was always for me a drawback of V's character, because V is also a really, I don't know, she's just such a typecast character in my opinion. Like, she's strong and outspoken and all of these things, and I want her to be all of those things because she should be, but is she all of those things because she's Black? And I just it was always a tension for me. Is she cast like this for this, like, very specifically, or is this just what the character V is supposed to be like? But yeah, you just said that when you said community care, I was just like, oh my god, she's a mammy, like, she's taking care of the white folk, like,
totally.
That's what she does constantly.
Yeah,
and Fiona, she's constantly carrying Fiona's emotions and like Fiona's failings, like, whoa. You just blew open my mind to this whole part that I could feel the tension, but I couldn't articulate the tension, and you just hit on it for me, where in that way she's a caretaker, and it's just such a waste of her as a character, because she could be so much more than that.
Yeah.
I think I think at some point in the show, not that this excuses any way that she is typecast whatsoever, but I think it was mentioned in the show that she was in nursing school for a while, and then had to drop out for, financial or circumstantial reasons. So that's why she is the aide in the nursing home and all of that thing. She was actually going to be a nurse and or a doctor, but then her circumstances. So that's why they trust her with that. Because she actually does genuinely have that knowledge in her head. Not to say that excuses the trope that they used at all, But
it's a weird tension, right? Like, it's a weird
yeah.
tension where they build this character and we get this, you know, information. You're right. Now that you say that, I do recall that. We get this weird, but it's a weird tension, right? Where you're like, yeah, okay. And in some ways you're not doing this very well. And
Yeah.
I love Kevin and V's relationship, but I
So
also I love their relationship, and I also have that tension about why does she have to be great in relation to white men?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair.
Why does Kevin have to be white?
For his later arc in where his family comes from.
Yes. And storytelling wise, yes, Kev has to be white because of the arc that they wrote for him.
Yeah.
And I still think it's a real, you know, hey, writers, why did Kevin have to be white? And not to say that, like, you know, there can't be interracial relationships in TV shows. It's just unfortunately the way that they did it in some capacity, I think redefines that, you know, V can only be great in relation to Kevin, who's a white man.
I agree. Yeah, I have. Yeah, there's a lot of tension there because it's like, is this a realistic representation of a poor relationship in Southside Chicago? Maybe. I don't know. I don't live in the South Side, but also it does feel very cliche and like you're just making this character a black trope, right? That being said, I love Veronica so much. Like, she is strong. I don't think she's ever presented as like the, in quotes, angry black woman. She's very strong and assertive, but like I don't think that they ever like present, like, she's always the rational one. You know, when things are happening, she's always the one to step in and be like, wait, let's think about this for a minute. Not like, she is never presented that way, which I appreciate, but then, you know, she fills a bunch of other categories that are super problematic.
And that's tension.
Yeah.
Because to me, like, I want her to be all of those things. And I can also acknowledge that I can acknowledge because I can't know, or I can hypothesize that perhaps when other black women are watching us, they're like, oh, look, here I am again. Typecast as serving white people, holding their emotions, holding space for their emotions. I have to be the logical and rational one here because look at these white people over here showing their asses. And I think especially with everything going on in the world right now, we need to be really conscious of when we're framing black women in that way, because they do so much work that they never get credited for. And I can definitively say that V never gets credit for how much she fucking works her butt off in that show. And I think that's buying into that stereotype and typecasting and just that whole culture of not having any respect for black women at all. Yeah. And so I love her as a character, and yet I'm sad sometimes when I'm watching it because it's easy to put her into that category. And I think maybe, like, and I can't speak for how BIPOC people might feel it when they watch it, because I am very white from all of the things that I have read and the knowledge that I choose to interact with. It comes across that way to me.
Agreed. I will say I'm going to get off the topic of Veronica a little bit, but still talking about race, and let's talk about Liam.
Let's talk about Liam. So for those of you who don't know, Liam is Black, and he is, in fact, the biological child of Frank and Monica Gallagher, whom are both white.
Yeah.
And the way that they justify this is some convoluted distorted somewhere in the history of the past of Frank's family. There were Black people in the family. That's how they justify it. Which is, I was like,
yeah. Just somehow there's like this recessive gene.
And they do, so eventually, but it takes them seasons to do it. Liam goes on, but he has to do it himself. Liam chooses to go on his own journey to discover that he's lacking in a culture that he belongs to. But
I would also argue that that's like reality. You know, like a white family in a white neighborhood that has a single Black friend who is raising a Black baby is, especially if you don't have the time to sit back and reflect on anything, because let's be honest, they don't have the time to sit back and reflect on anything in this show. Fiona's working like basically 24/7. You know, they wouldn't have that time to sit back and be like, what does he need beyond food, shelter, education? You know, like they're just at like the base level of the human needs pyramid here. We're supplying him with things to survive, and they can't think past that.
Oh,
so I would
sure.
argue that is like kind of a reality for the family setting that they have. But I'm glad that the writers eventually were like, whoa, we really dropped the ball here. We should probably have Liam interacting with some other Black kids and like learning about Black culture. Which they do.
He does, yeah, towards the end. And I agree with you. I do agree with you, Jenna. I do think like they eventually address it, but it's kind of just not addressed up until the point that they address it. So it's a very and they do use him at one point. So Monica comes back, which is the mom. She's in a relationship with a Black woman. And this Black woman, they typecast as the angry Black woman. She's like, we're taking Liam. He doesn't belong with you white folks. Like he needs, and on the one hand, you're like, yeah, he should be interacting with his culture, but it's the way that they did it that was so just mess. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Because
she's also typecast as a butch lesbian.
She's like butch, lesbian, angry Black woman. I'm like, could you do more of a disservice to this character? Yeah. Like, could you? Really? Like, it's so bad. And I think for sure, just generally overall for Shameless, and I still do consider it one of my favorite TV shows, and I also understand all the inherent problems within it, is that they are really good about addressing a lot of issues so long as it's in relation to whiteness. But they are terrible at addressing any of these issues if they're in relation to BIPOC people. And I don't even get me started on their representation or lack thereof, or very stereotyped of Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a whole other conversation.
That could be like a whole podcast in and of itself. It's very limited. I will say, suffice to say, it's very like tangential. My words are not
transcendental.
They really typecast them as like living on reserves.
It's really bad. It's really
living
bad.
on reserves, casinos, spirituality. There's a group of children that come into the storyline, and one of them, they just give them, I'm not even going to say the names.
It's so bad. We can't. I refuse to.
They just give them these really gross, tropey, awful, like Indigenous sounding names. Like they just shit the bed, really, truly.
It was really, really awful. And can we also talk about the fact that, what was her name? The white lady, Sheila, finds out that she has a minute percentage of this specific tribe blood in her, and then just like fully goes into it and is like, it's okay that I'm appropriating your culture, realistically, is what she's doing, because I'm one of you. And she even goes as far as trying to adopt these children she sits in front of like, I think they call it a tribal council in the show.
Yes.
Which is a whole other thing.
Again, attention, because it just depends on how the bands or the tribes or whatever
absolutely.
choose to title their meetings where they all come together and have conversation. However, the way that they did it is terrible.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. And they were basically like, thank you for your interest in these children. However, we're going to keep them here with us. Thanks. And basically, they would then be raised by their grandfather on the reserve. It was just like this horrible, like, white savior moment of, I'm going to rescue these indigenous children from the reserve, which, can we talk about how that is just like all of North American history? Really? Like colonial history? Colonial history. We'll say colonial because it happens everywhere. But that I actually had forgotten about that until you mentioned the issues with indigeneity in the show.
And again, it's attention, because they're alerting us to the fact that white people shouldn't be going in and doing that. Like, that's the whole reason why at the end of the day they tell Sheila, no, these children are staying with us.
Yeah.
They need to grow up in their culture and understand their tradition. And your 1/16th, 1/18th blood quantum, which is something that we don't do in Canada, but what they do it in the States, doesn't make you Indigenous, by the way. So on the one hand...
Especially because she didn't grow up in the culture.
No. On the one hand, they talk about some things that are important. On the other hand, they're othered so much. They don't exist in Southside Chicago. I don't even think they exist in Chicago as far as the show is concerned.
No, it was definitely like a travel to get there.
Yeah. They exist on the reserve. They exist other. They don't belong here. They're historical. They're like, it's just awful. It's so colonial. It's such a colonial mentality where Indigenous people are othered, not just othered to the point where we literally are like, physically you're othered, you're in this other space. And then the other part that was kind of this was earlier on, so Sheila's daughter Karen gets run over and suffers really traumatic brain damage, and she takes her to this place in Arizona where there's like healing stuff, but they also, the way they talk about that is really
rooted in
uncritical
culture.
Yeah, like, but they're doing it in such a way where you automatically are like, fake science, like, you know what I mean? Where if you're uncritical, you're just going to be like, well, that's not going to work, because it's not like, we didn't scientifically method this and make sure that it was like a valid way of healing. They just make it kind of seem like fluffy and silly. And I'm like, people healing, like, as a social worker, yes, obviously I have therapeutic models that have been, tested and validated to the best of Western knowledge's ability to scientifically validate them. And I also know things like faith, which is hard to validate, can be really important for people for healing. And where is it in my job and my role as a therapist? Why am I going to tell you that you can't do that because science doesn't validate it? Absolutely not. That's not how it works. So I think that, just indigeneity and spirituality. So anything that wasn't like white Judeo-Christian, they just tear all over the place.
White Christian, because the way that they treat Judaism is also...
Oh yes, I totally... So, and I sit here and critique all of these things, and people are going to be like, wait, you said you really like this show.
Yeah.
And I'll say why. The reason that I like this show is because they do choose to be brave, in the sense that they talk about a lot of things that we do not want to talk about in society. And they do go boldly into some areas where other TV shows do not go. And they can be really dark at times, and I think that's good. Life can be dark, and we have to take that darkness with joy. And I think that's the thing throughout the show that I always can always see. And we can critique this, but for me, personally, this is what I loved. Dark, hard, messy, complicated, always hope. Always hope.
Yeah.
I love that.
Always hope.
Yeah. There's good and bad. The reason that it's one of my favorite shows is because I'm able to sit there and go, ooh, that was not okay. But I understand that a lot of people are not going to be sitting there watching this critically and just be like, oh, that representation of an Indigenous person is what Indigenous people are like. Or mental health is, the way that they represent mental health is their way of representing that. Or disability in general, as something to be fixed. Like Karen, when she gets hit by the car, this is where I thought you were going with that. I completely forgot about the other thing. She gets a traumatic brain injury, and this is so good. I forgot about. Okay, it's not good in Shameless. It's great in The Fosters. So I'm like, as we're talking about these other shows, I'm like, oh, The Fosters did this too, but they did it well. So Karen has a traumatic brain injury and like doesn't have the actual symptoms of a traumatic brain injury as are like standard, like memory loss and inability to regulate emotions and things like that. She just fully reverts back to being like 5 years old.
Yeah, it's speech, like really infantilizing.
Completely infantilizing. Like in her speech, in the way that she wants to like cuddle up with like a stuffy, like stuff like that. She also gave birth to a child with Down syndrome.
Oh God.
And that was a whole thing. So Sheila, I thought, did really well in her temporary raising of Jaime. But then when the child's paternal grandmother comes to take him away, says, we have you forgot about this, didn't you?
Oh, I did. And I have things.
Yeah. So when the paternal grandmother comes to take the child away to live with them, she says something along the lines of, we have ancient medicines that will fix him. Like almost word for word, that is the quote.
So here's, again, though, this is racism. They're embedding racism. So I believe the paternal father is Chinese American.
Yes.
From
what I'm remembering, yeah.
Yeah. And they are basically typecasting. And it's one of these tensions where, I know individuals who work in our public education system, who work with children who have developmental needs, who have behavioral needs. And they say, sometimes when the parents immigrate and they come here, there are negative attitudes and beliefs towards disability. And so, yes, that's reality. But if we're doing, again,
only Asian character.
Exactly. It's the only Asian character in the TV show, or this, well, yes, because the other one is half white. It's the only actually fully Asian character in the TV show. And what do? Well, she thinks she can fix this child who has Down syndrome through ancient Chinese medicine. Like, can you think of anything more stereotypical and racist? Like, it was so
she also,
awful.
I believe she speaks very broken English. Like,
like they just were like typecast Asian character.
Yeah.
And it was just terrible. And I agree with you. Like, if we're talking, so we've kind of talked about race a lot, but like I said, they shit the bed on race, truly. And a lot of the stuff they did. And the disability piece, they also don't do a great job of either. They infantilize Karen when she has the traumatic brain injury. Jaime, who has Down syndrome, they do this whole awful piece where they talk about like language around it, where like,
I forgot.
Like, I'm not going to mention the word because I don't believe in saying it, but the R word, they have this whole episode where they basically like try to discuss,
take it back.
that tension between, you know, labels that are given versus when communities maybe want to take labels back, but they do it in such a terrible, clunky, broken way that I don't believe at the end of the episode you're just like, that was uncomfortable. Like, not gonna lie. Yeah. When they talk about when they're talking about disability, it's a lot about Frank. And alcoholism can be a disability. Mm-hmm. But they never critically talk about it that way. They always talk about it in the way that he's an alcoholic and he's trying to scam to be disabled, as opposed to, you know what I mean? Like, they're like, his alcoholism makes him have to be cheating the system. And so then they're constructing disability as something where you're taking money away from
mm-hmm. people that deserve it. Or like welfare in general is always in the show presented as taking away from the system justifiably.
And you know what they never talk about in the show? Food stamps.
Ever.
Somehow the Gallaghers always just find enough money to make it by, which to me means...
No, they do talk about food stamps at one point.
Do they?
They do. When Debbie has her kid, Debbie goes on food stamps temporarily. And when it's her turn to go grocery shopping for the family, she goes and gets her food stamps, and they gave her a block of Velveeta, some pasta or something, and like a bouillon cube or something ridiculous. Like, it was like not indicative at all of what you get on food stamps, I am assuming. It was done poorly. It was done in one episode for one scene, and it was done horrifically. Although we don't know what the system is like in the States. Maybe that is what you get.
But still, again, it's this very like uncritical, very poor, very backwards representation, which I think that they do it intentionally, because I believe that they're buying into this idea that people on welfare are all Franks, where they're just trying to steal money. And speaking to, again, following this discussion about disability, we come to Ian, who is bipolar, and they exploit the crap out of his bipolar disorder. And it sucks, because when they first start doing it, there's almost hope that they're going to talk about it in this really beautiful and nuanced way. And they show it really, like, based off of my education. Like, I studied the DSM-V, which I could critique all day, but like, based off of like our kind of understanding, they do a really good job of showing like the manic side of it, and then that really like hard crash depressive side of it. And they do it really, they show that really well, but then all of a sudden it becomes a plot point and they just fucked it up. Like, they take it to the point where he starts, it's like funny. It's not funny. He starts this the Church of Gay Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Literally having like, he believes he's like sort of an incarnation in a way, like he's saving all the gay youth, the trans youth, the lesbian from conversion therapy. So again, it's all of these weird tensions where like they mean well in the story that they want to tell, but then they just fuck it up. But then he ends up blowing up a vehicle. So what are we doing? We're equating bipolar disorder, we're equating mental illness, we're equating all of these things with violence, which means that they're crazy, which means that they need to be othered, where they go to jail. You know what I mean? Like,
it's hard, because in that entire arc, it's like they're doing such a great job of showing what a shit fuck mess conversion therapy is, and how the only saving that needs to be done is saving the kids from conversion therapy. And then they do the gay Jesus thing, and it's just but also the fact that Ian was able to read through and memorize the Bible so quickly and use it against that pastor was like one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah, it's like this, there's so much tension, I think. So, like, generally, I think there's, like, that's the whole show, though. And in a way, like I said, I think that's reality. Like, it is all of these tensions. It is our inability to be effective in our articulation and communication, whether it's because we lack knowledge or we lack education, or it's just too hard to speak about them, or, you know, we're ignorant, or we don't want to know, or we want to shut our ears off and we don't want to hear and we don't want to engage. It's a very messy, complicated show. And I would still encourage people to watch it because, like I said, there's some beautiful moments of hope in it. I would say though, like, we've just talked about a lot of like serious content, and I will say two things that are serious trigger warnings, which they absolutely should have on the TV show. So one, you watch an individual commit suicide in a very non-graphic way, but it's still a thing. And then two, and this actually really disturbed me, Monica, and this is trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about self-harm. Monica Geller slashes her wrists in the kitchen, and they don't spare you any sort of grace. Like, you have to look, like, it's like full on, you're staring at the whole thing. And that's really hard for me personally to watch. So just be aware that throughout this TV show, there are going to be pieces that, if you have personal experiences, there's lots of triggers throughout the show for sure. And they need to, like, Netflix needs to get with the times and put trigger warnings in their descriptions of the TV shows. Like, can we just agree?
Before the episode,
being critical,
or like during the commercial break or something along those lines. Yeah, I agree. So final thoughts. It covers a lot of different themes, from poverty and class and race and sexuality and gender and all of, you know, addiction and mental health and disability and stuff. It covers those. Some it does well. Some are kind of meh, and others they completely fucking shit the bed on. But so I guess for me, the last thing that I want to really say is, it's a great show if you can watch it and go, that part is not okay, and you know what those parts are. If you don't have the critical eye or the critical lens to watch this show and understand that things that they are doing are completely incorrect, racist, sexist, transphobic, whatever, go off and do that education for yourself first, then go back and watch the show. Do not watch this show as a complete representation of what it's like to be a Black woman. And I'm not saying that, like, people like me don't exist. It's the same thing as that the Chinese immigrant mother. Why is the only character that represents this entire group of people a trope, and an extremely problematic trope?
Yeah.
So, great show if you can watch it with a critical eye. Not such a great show if you're just watching it for entertainment value and taking it at surface level.
You can't. It's not a show. I really strongly believe it's not a show you can take at surface level. And I do believe in some way, shape, and form that is intentional. It's a drama, first of all, which should tell you a lot of things. Second of all, it's a drama about America, which should tell you some more things. It is not meant to be sitting there with your popcorn, laughing, where, you know, you don't get to laugh at these poor people. In fact, if you're very empathetic, there's gonna be a lot of points where you just are like, and that was a good episode, I need to go away and think about it. And that's the point of the show. I truly believe the creators of the show wanted to have commentary, wanted to do that. And I also believe that we can still do better.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you for that, because I love shows that are social commentary. So this one's on my list to watch now. So thank you both so much for discussing the show. This was such an interesting and fruitful conversation. So I really, really appreciate it. And it definitely makes me want to watch it now. So, Netflix, look out. Yeah, so I guess just as a final thing, we wanted to thank you so much, Imogene, for being a guest today. We really appreciate your insights, and it's always a pleasure. So thank
Yes.
you everyone for listening to this episode of Critical Rep. You can find us on all socials at Critical Rep Pod, which is critical REPOD, or email us at criticalreppodcast@gmail.com. And that's Critical Rep Podcast with 1P. So please like and share on whatever platform you prefer. Write us a review on iTunes and subscribe on YouTube. The Critical Rep Podcast is hosted by Jenna and Kat, two people who want to explore the world of representation in popular film media. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. So until next time, think critical and remember, representation matters.